You're listening to Digging Star Wars, the online journal of the films that inspired George Lucas to create the Star Wars saga. Hello, space boys and girls, and welcome to the Season 1 finale of Digging Star Wars. In this episode, we're going to talk about Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, and its ties to James Cameron's The Terminator. But first, allow me to introduce our guest, my good friend, Mr. David P. Ramos. Dave is an accomplished cinematographer and storyboard artist. He has served as a director of photography on a number of my own films, including The Road Taken, which was our thesis film from our college days, my experimental film MFL, which continues to screen all over the world. It's been doing so for about 10 years, and maybe even longer. And the award-winning comedic short we did, Terrible Twos. As a matter of fact, this Digging Star Wars episode features music from Terrible Twos. Most recently, Dave served as DP on the minor league baseball documentary entitled Time in the Minors, which is on sale online at www.oshowproductions.com. That's www.ohshowproductions.com. And that, Mr. Ramos, is perhaps the longest guest introduction to date. So what do you think of that?
I think it's completely appropriate on Star Wars Day.
That's true. It's May 4th when we're recording this. So exciting news about the Blu-ray. I know a lot of fans are really psyched up about that, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I got to read up on it.
Yeah, it looks like they dug up even more interesting, never-before-seen content. So
cool.
Cool stuff. Well, welcome, Dave. Dave has been very hard at work researching the first installment in the Terminator film series. So, Dave, what can you tell us about James Cameron's film that started it all?
Oh, well, first I want to say thanks for having me on the blog. I'm a fan of the blog. It's been good hearing all the episodes you've put together.
Oh, you're very kind.
So Terminator. I'm going to take a quote right from the Wikipedia entry on the description of the film. Terminator is a 1984 science fiction action film directed by James Cameron, co-written by Cameron and William Wisher Jr., starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, Michael Biehn, and Linda Hamilton. The film was produced by Hemdale Film Corporation and distributed by Orion Pictures and filmed in Los Angeles. Schwarzenegger plays the Terminator, a cyborg assassin sent back in time from the year 2029 to 1984 to kill Sarah Connor, played by Hamilton. Biehn plays Kyle Reese, a soldier from the future sent back in time to protect Sarah. The film has garnered some of the AFI lists. It's 42nd on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Thrills, a list of America's most heart-hunting. Oh, am I jumping the gun here?
No, that's great.
Okay.
Did not know that.
And it was also, the Terminator was selected as the 22nd greatest movie villain on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Heroes and Villains. And Arnold's catchphrase, "I'll be back," was voted the 37th greatest movie quote by AFI.
Wow. That's pretty impressive stuff.
Yes. Of course, it also pretty much launched the career of James Cameron and Schwarzenegger. The budget on the film was $6.5 million, and the gross revenue is listed at $78 million. Not sure if that's worldwide or if that's domestic.
Okay.
What else can I say about it? Definitely was the beginning of the, I think it was kind of a resurgence of the kind of sci-fi thriller, bringing that back in the 80s. Of course, it also launched the whole idea of the Terminator and the animation and eventually CGI. When Cameron first started thinking about the film, he actually wanted to use the idea of the T-1000 from the second film, where the cyborg mutated and was made of liquid metal.
Mm-hmm.
But in 1984, they couldn't do that. There was no technology to make that happen. So they came up with the other idea of just having a skeleton cyborg. So it wasn't until technology caught up to Cameron's idea that he was able to do the T-1000 in the second film.
That's cool because it's kind of like the same story with Jaws and Spielberg. Like, they couldn't get the effect they wanted, so they changed the film, and
right.
You can't think of that film being any other way than the way it is now. Like, the Terminator and Schwarzenegger and that metal skeleton is so iconic.
Right.
It's almost like a good thing that technology wasn't where it needed to be.
Right. Yeah, I think, and overall, the fact that the film is more, it's not really about so much the special effects. It's about the storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that he puts the film together, because he had to, he didn't have the technology he wanted, and he had to make it work with what he had.
Well, I thought it was interesting too was when we were communicating about talking about Terminator, you had brought up The Outer Limits, and you had brought up something that Cameron kind of just casually threw aside. What was it, Starlog, or what magazine was it?
Yeah, I think it was in a magazine, an interview in Starlog, supposedly, where someone asked him where he came up with the idea for the film, and he's like, I ripped off a couple of Outer Limit episodes. And the guy who wrote those two episodes, his name is Harlan Ellison, sci-fi writer, American sci-fi writer, found the article and decided to sue Cameron and the studio for plagiarizing his material. The two episodes, one's called Soldier and the other one's called Demon with the Glass Hand. He wrote them both for Outer Limits in the 60s. And I actually went, the reason I even brought up the whole Harlan Ellison thing is at the end of the film, there's a credit in the Terminator acknowledging the works of Harlan Ellison. I was a Harlan Ellison fan, so I started to look it up on the net about what that was all about, why that was there, and discovered the whole lawsuit with Outer Limits.
Right.
And basically, he brought the suit against Cameron and the film company, and they settled out of court. And part of the settlement, they gave him a bunch of money, which no one knows how much money he got, but the other part of the settlement was a credit in the film. And basically, I don't know if the credit ever was in the actual theatrical release, but it was in every other flavor after that, the DVD, the video cassette.
What's cool about that, before we even go into talking about those Outer Limit episodes and what's that, we've actually dug another layer. Like, it's digging Star Wars, digging Terminator.
Right.
That kind of found it back, and I think that's pretty cool.
And then, I guess before we move on to another fact that I didn't know about the film that I found out was that in 2008, it was selected by the Library of Congress for preservation, for being deemed culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant.
Wow.
So it's part of the United States National Film Registry now.
That's cool. I think we covered Enter the Dragon earlier this season on Digging Star Wars, and the same honor was bestowed to that, so that's pretty cool.
Right.
Did you get to watch the two episodes of Outer Limits?
I didn't get to see the Demon with the Glass Hand, but I did watch Soldier, which as Soldier was more of what he drew from than the other episode.
Mm-hmm.
And Soldier, it's pretty bizarre if you watch it. The opening of Soldier is pretty close to the opening of Terminator.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
The way that the camera shoots the landscape and even just elements of the landscape are directly echoed in the opening of the Terminator. And so the episode is about these two soldiers that are in some sort of war in the future, and they accidentally get transported back in time to present time, 1964. And the one soldier ends up getting he has an incident that happens with the police, and the government gets a hold of him, and then he starts getting studied by this psychologist. trying to find out why he's here and where he's from. Because at first they think he might be an alien, but then the psychologist begins to realize that he's from Earth. He's just not from their time.
Right.
So it's funny because after I watched the episode, I started to see parallels with this episode, not so much with the original Terminator, but with the second film, the Terminator 2, because the psychologist in the Outer Limits episode is trying to figure out how the soldier communicates, and he's also teaching the soldier how to be human, because in the episode the soldier is completely bred to be a soldier. There's in his future there is no love, or there is only war, and he's bred just for that war. So all he knows is violence and war.
Right.
So this psychologist, in his present time when he gets transported back, he's trying to teach the soldier about love, and he's trying to teach him about being human. That was really similar to what happens with the Terminator and John Connor in the second one. So that was really interesting. But there is, and I also know that through the research I did on the Terminator, that his original idea was to have two Terminators come back from the future in the Terminator.
And in addition to Reese?
No, I think it was going to be, well, yeah, I guess it would have been in addition to Reese.
Okay. So it's basically 3 time travelers.
Yeah. So it might have been that he had an idea of having the 2 Terminators, one protecting Sarah and one trying to kill her.
Oh, okay, right. Okay.
Which, he does in the second film.
Right.
But that also ties it to Soldier, having these 2 sort of Terminators, if you will, go back in time, because they're both just bred to fight each other in the Outer Limits episode.
Right.
So and you got to watch it, you said, right?
Yeah, I got to watch Soldier. I thought, same thing that you said, that the beginning of the film was like, whoa, this is Terminator. With the barren landscape and the way that there's like beams of light shooting from the heavens down to the warriors and the whole bit. Thought that was interesting. And then, there's other time travel things where I can see Cameron got it. The thing that I thought was very interesting was the line in the Soldier. I think it's the psychiatrist or the linguist. I think it's the linguist that they sent to study him, is explaining, he was born to be a killer, trained to be a killer. He doesn't understand hate or love. And I definitely read in that line, that's the Terminator too. I can certainly see that.
Right.
But, and of course comparing that, I was comparing the Terminator a lot to Anakin.
Right.
And, as far as the Star Wars element. And I said, well, unfortunately that line is the direct opposite of Anakin, because Anakin's all about hate and love, especially in episode 3.
Right.
But I thought it was a very interesting episode, and it was interesting to see the kind of precursor to the Terminator.
Right.
Okay, so, you mentioned that you didn't get a chance to watch Demon with the Glass Hand, but I did, and it was very interesting because I am a closet Robert Culp fan, and he is the lead in that. So,
okay.
It was interesting to see him there. Of course you think of I Spy, as soon as because he's there in the white pants and sneakers, even though he's a soldier, whatever. But it was, it was interesting, and I felt with Soldier, the episode left you with more questions than answers.
Right.
Like, it wasn't very conclusive, and you kind of felt like, what just happened? Whereas with Demon with the Glass Hand, he spelled it out a lot once you got to the end. I mean, it was a good, it's funny because it was very, film noir meets science fiction. So I guess like tech noir, which is something I'm going to talk about later with Terminator in episode 3.
Right.
But, the thing about Demon with the Glass Hand is it's the circular timeline, time travel concept from that particular episode. And I know I'm not going to, I encourage people to watch it or at least read a synopsis of it to understand what I'm about to go through. But, the show is certainly more Terminator than Sith. However, in the episode, Robert Culp is not sure who or what he is, and he's learning as he goes through the episode. And one thing he quickly learns is that he has this glass hand, and it doesn't have all its digits, doesn't have all its fingers. And not only is it a glass hand, but there's mechanics in it, and he talks to it, and it's like a mini computer that talks back to him. It was almost similar to Quantum Leap's Ziggy that Al had, and it was always talking to his hand. It had the same type of thing where the hand had all the information and would tell him the next step, but wouldn't tell him the whole story.
Okay.
So he'd be in a situation and he'd be trapped, and he would, pardon the pun, talk to the hand. He would talk to it and say, I'm trapped in a building and they have guns. And then the hand would say, you should go out to the hallway and turn left. There you will find this thing. And then Robert Culp would go out and do that, and then it would evolve the story. So the hand was an integral part to the turning of events. And as the story goes on, as he's battling these bad guys in this episode, he gathers up a missing finger. They possess the fingers, and through battling them, he keeps attaching finger to the hand, and his hand gives him more information. He becomes more aware of what his destiny is, and till his hand's complete. And very trippy episode.
Yeah.
Because he's holding, it's a glass stiff hand. Like, it's not like he can manipulate his fingers or move them, and he wears a glove over it, which of course is very Star Wars. He has this mechanical hand, and he's wearing a glove over it. And of course, wearing the glove's more a production thing, I think, so that Robert Culp could easily move about.
Right.
And of course, he uses that hand gloved to grab things, but whenever he takes the glove off, it's this stiff glass hand that doesn't bend or have any joints. So it's kind of interesting in that way. But the hand was the driving force in that story. And as our Terminator fans know, the Terminator hand, the only surviving body part of the original Terminator in the first film, is what sets up the whole Skynet and the like for T2 and I guess subsequent films. It's the hand that was left behind.
Right.
In the 80s that, the last thing that reached at Sarah Connor in the final battle that brought the story on, and that's kind of cool because it's just as equally as important as it was in the Outer Limits episode. And of course, the mechanical hand has huge significance in the Star Wars world.
Right.
We first saw it in Empire when Luke gets his hand cut off by Vader. And then, of course, in Jedi, when Luke reverses and cuts Vader's hand off, and they have that bond. And then when the prequels come around, talk about traveling at a time in a circular thing. Anakin, of course, loses his hand, and it's a huge thing. And ultimately, the mechanical hand, as far as Star Wars is concerned, really is about, it's a bridging the generation gap, like father, like son. And of course, when Luke slices off Vader's hand, not only is he kind of doing an eye for an eye thing for Vader, but that's part of the whole son redeeming the father thing. It's in weakening Vader and beating Vader that he's able to connect with him and obviously bring Vader back to the light side of the Force.
Right.
And there's a lot of stuff with mechanical hands in the expanded universe. I forget which book it was. I want to say it's Labyrinth of Evil or not Labyrinth of Evil except for 3, but one of the books after 3, where Vader's going around and hunting down the last of the Jedi. You hear the inner thoughts of Palpatine, and he loves the fact that Vader has mechanical hands because he'll never be able to do Force lightning. It's like the Emperor has one up on Vader.
Uh-huh.
And so this episode, Outer Limits, although it was somewhat awkward and you're watching it, this really is, it's like, it's looking at the original structure. It's looking at an ancestor of what would later be in sci-fi something very important, both in Terminator and Star Wars.
Right.
So that was kind of cool, and you should definitely check it out.
Yeah. Well, a note to the listeners. I mean, they're both available on Hulu.com.
Yeah, it's where I watched them,
free.
and so I'm really glad you pointed it out because it was a lot of fun to watch, and they're hour long episodes, and it flies pretty quick, especially if you have an interest in either in just in sci-fi in general or in Terminator or Star Wars, because you definitely can see where this is something worth checking out.
Right.
Before I head on, is there anything you want to talk more about Terminator, or should we just get right to the Star Wars connections?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a couple of, I thought some of the tidbits in the Wikipedia entry on Terminator, I thought some of them were kind of interesting. One of the things it points out is that, Schwarzenegger only has 18 lines in the film.
That's funny.
Which is pretty funny. And I never realized that. I mean, it makes sense, but, and then, Lance Hendrickson plays a cop in the film. And, of course he goes back with Cameron. I guess they were friends, and they also he'd been in other movies worked on other movies with Cameron. And when they were pitching the film, he actually had, Lance Hendrickson show up to a meeting as the Terminator. He sent him into the meeting before, by himself, and he had foil on his teeth, and he had a motorcycle jacket on, and he went in and kind of trashed the office.
That's awesome.
Before the meeting, and then Cameron came in right behind him and did the whole pitch for the movie.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, thought that was interesting. That's about it. And then the other thing that I thought was funny, that it was number one at the box office until the third week, where it got knocked off by Oh God, You Devil.
Wow.
Knocked out of the number one spot by Burns, Mr. Burns.
By George Burns. Just you mentioning that it was number one at the box office, I think it's interesting too, because I don't remember the success of Terminator, I guess because of my age, but yeah, sure, there was a sequel, so you would think because there was a sequel, the original film did great, right? That's not always the case, in Hollywood. Sometimes it's just they plan sequels, and that's the way it's going to be. But I was surprised, and I don't know about you, but I felt like we were reading essays about the Terminator back when we were in college in Philly many moons ago. A lot. There was a lot of academic work about the time travel thing, and, man versus machine, and it was about the original Terminator movie. It wasn't about the sequels. And T2 was obviously slick, and I've heard varying opinions on T3 and T4, but I thought that was very interesting that the first film garnered that much attention, which I think spoke to the success of it.
Right.
Didn't you find that odd? I mean, didn't you find that odd that there was so much written about the time travel aspect of the film?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, the other films tend to focus on the technology and, all the stuff that it brought to, the movie-making world.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one, everyone more focused on what the story was and the time travel element, and it didn't really talk about so much the technology in the movie or the fact that what it introduced. So yeah, it's interesting that it's, because it was such a small film. It was only made for $6 million,
it's crazy when you think about it.
Yeah. And all filmed in Los Angeles, and, at the time pretty much starred, unknowns.
Right.
Even Cameron, before Terminator, all he made was the Piranha movies. So, in fact, I think, one of the ways he got funding for it was through, because he was a student of Roger Corman.
Right.
And, there was someone he knew through the Roger Corman studios that, could find money for films. And so he approached that guy and basically, he's like, well, I'll produce it if you can go out and, I'll find some money, but if you can find, funding as well, then we'll make it, and it was just like, they just had this idea and they just did it, and also it's apparently, I mean, according to the stuff that I read, he had a dream about the Terminator, when he was working on some, movie in Rome or something. And he had a dream about being chased by this metal man. And that's
Cameron did.
Yeah, Cameron did. And
Okay.
That's what sort of sparked the idea, in his head. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, well, that's kind of interesting. And because when I think of the first film, I think of those, Stan Winston stop motion shots of that machine,
right,
coming at you, which of course as a kid you're just enamored with. You're just like, whoa, it's so cool. And
yeah,
last week when I was sitting on the couch with my wife and we're watching it, she just started laughing seeing it because obviously special effects has come such a long way.
Right.
And
yeah, I mean, I think when I watched it again, seeing the stuff with Arnold where he's cutting his eye out, and I mean, it's all it looks pretty rudimentary now, but really back in '84, that was, it was definitely cutting edge stuff they were doing.
Yeah.
With the makeup and all of that. I mean, even the stuff that they were doing where it was like all the shots from the Terminator's point of view, where you're seeing like, all the parameters and things like that, and you're seeing, I mean, stuff like that hadn't necessarily been done before.
Yeah, and that's what's cool. And as we've kind of been harping on, it was really about the story.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's, people wrote about it because of that whole time travel thing.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
It was something different, and it was, you start trying to, think about the way it's working and the whole circular thing of it, and it was a very cool concept at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. When I first started researching Digging Star Wars, not just this particular episode, but the series in general, Cameron's Terminator kept popping up on various sites. So I knew it would have to be one of the films we covered in this first season, in my first couple of episodes. And in researching, I think the biggest connection between Terminator and Revenge of the Sith is that infamous mechanical hand close-up shot of it reaching and dragging the torso of the Terminator in the you know what I'm talking about, right? In the final battle.
Right near the end of the film.
Yeah, in the final battle, Terminator, after Reese has blown up the Terminator, the machine, Arnold, the machine is only an upper torso, and it's still functional, and it slowly but ever so menacingly pulls itself towards the seemingly innocent Sarah Connor. And there's a beautiful close-up of that mechanical hand that's grasping and dragging itself towards Sarah.
Right.
Likewise, in Sith, after Obi-Wan has cut off Anakin's legs and his good arm in the famous I've got the higher ground battle, Anakin uses his mechanical hand to drag himself away from the lava river, and we get that same beautiful close-up of the mechanical hand grasping the loose gravel and as he pulls himself up to safety. I want to know from you as a director of photography, do you think that's the same? Do you think that's a direct nod to the Terminator? And is it a solid inspiration, or is that just merely coincidence?
I would have to say I would go more the coincidence route than anything, but I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't something that crossed their minds. I mean, it's definitely that shot is, everyone remembers that from Terminator. And I went back and looked specifically because we talked about this before, and in that particular shot. And if you look at the shot in Terminator and look at the shot in Sith, it's almost exactly the same.
Right.
So it's hard not to make that connection and say that, yeah, that's something that they were certainly considering. Because it certainly connects the two films, but also connects the whole idea with, I kind of feel like at some point Anakin becomes the Emperor's Terminator anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's part of the thing too, that as we're going through episode by episode and film by film, I never kind of officially pushed this out to people listening, but these are all debatable. And in the case of the Lawrence Arabia episode, we called out, like, this is the exact location that Lawrence Arabia shot this scene in.
Right.
And Lucas shot the scene for episode 2. They're not always going to be like that. It's going to be like, well, how do we shoot this? Well, we should shoot it this way. And I think Carrie Fisher said that Lucas has such a film knowledge, a thirst and appreciation of film, and it just kind of seeps out of his pores.
Right.
And he doesn't even know it. So, half the time he's just pulling things and doesn't know it. And, I mean, the appropriation factor is huge, and it is what it is. So that's what we're here to talk about, which is great. But, yeah, I was curious what you thought. And cause when I see the shot of Anakin's hand, I remember sitting in the theater thinking that, like, oh, that's the Terminator. And then,
right.
And when you watch both films, you're like, oh, they're kind of different. The framing's a little different, but you can't help but think of that. And I think the fact that Anakin is sort of that half torso by that point too emphasizes it even more.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But, I have a laundry list here of other things that I want to go through with you. And, it's in the same line of, is it coincidence or is it inspiration? So we'll go one by one, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So, first thing is that, and you kind of mentioned this, that both the Terminator and Darth Vader are killing cyborgs. Rather than just machines, they make it a point in Terminator, Reese does, and explains to Sarah Connor, he's got living flesh and tissue, and, he's not just a robot, like, there's real skin on him, hence when he's cutting his eye and working on the blood and whatnot. So, they are half flesh, half machines, and both, interestingly enough, see and process the world through that angry blood red vision. Now, in Sith, we only see Vader's red vision as the mask is lowered into place near the end of the film.
Right.
Where you see Anakin actually sees the mask and sees the eye visor piece that sees red. But this is overwhelmingly similar to the way the Terminator sees the world. Coincidence or inspiration? What do you think?
I don't know. I think that certainly could be inspired by, I mean, he's at that moment he's defining what Vader is going to become.
Mm-hmm.
Even though at that point Anakin's already there, but I mean, obviously the suit completes the transformation.
Right.
Going from the good side to the bad side, from the light to the dark. So, I can see that as certainly an inspiration, and you got to think about it from the point of view of not just Lucas, but like the people who worked on these things,
mm-hmm.
and the artists who worked on these things, the computer artists are our age probably.
Right.
So
right.
You got to take that into account, especially when you're looking at the prequels.
Yeah. Well, which kind of makes it fun, because when I'm talking about the original series, the original series themselves are considered by many now older films.
Right.
Because they're from the 70s and the 80s. And so their inspiration will obviously be, everything from the 1920s or whatever up to the 70s. So the prequels are fun because there's some things that we saw as kids or knew about, and kind of sneak in, which I think is great. The next thing is, again, coincidence or inspiration. I found it interesting that both films start with an intense battle between a battalion of humans versus a battalion of machines. In Terminator, it's the future war on Earth. And then in Sith, it's the space battle above Coruscant against Grievous's droid fleet, which then, you have Anakin and Obi-Wan in the ships, and they're battling, the Vulture droids and whatnot.
Right.
And then it continues on in Grievous's flagship.
Right.
And I just stumbled across that today. Today I watched Revenge of the Sith this morning.
Oh, okay.
And, and
I didn't.
I was like, wow, this is crazy. I never thought about that.
Right.
I'm thinking it's more coincidence, but I think it's a great coincidence.
Right. Yeah. It's a cool connection. Yeah, I would say it was more coincidence. Yeah, I didn't, cause I watched Sith first before I watched Terminator.
Oh, it's funny. I did the opposite. Another thing I found, which I thought was interesting, and you can throw a flag in the play and tell me if I'm stretching it here. It's fine. But I thought it was interesting that both films have a lead male character, so Reese and Anakin I'm talking about here, that I put carry in quotes here, but they carry around a future vision of their female mate. So in Terminator, Reese carries around this photo of Sarah Connor that he got from the grown-up John Connor in the future. And of course, it's beautifully played out at the end of the film when Sarah Connor's at the gas station and the little kid takes her picture and sells it to her, is the same picture.
Right.
But in Sith, Anakin keeps having these dreams about Padme and dying in labor. So, and the vision of Padme is repeated. It's in a dream early on in the film, and then mid to later in the film, when Anakin's starting to get uppity about Obi-Wan, he's like in the middle of a daydream and has that experience.
Right.
I thought that was interesting, and I don't know if it's a vague connection or not. What do you think?
I see the connection. It's interesting that with Anakin, I mean, everyone around him is telling him what he's seeing is not necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
But he is seeing, one of his possible futures, which is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought the fact that, I mean, it's funny because like seeing the future in your destiny has been in, I think, every Star Wars film.
Right.
But you don't think of it as time. You don't think of it as, and I talked a little bit about this in my previous episode with Housemaid of Dawn, how there's different concepts of time, classical European thought in I guess, mainstream America is that it's linear.
Right.
Then certain cultures, like various Native American tribes, it's cyclical.
Right.
So it's kind of, and Star Wars, of course, borrows from everything. So it's interesting how it kind of turns it on its end.
Right.
But I thought that was interesting. And then this is really more, I think, something I'd like to hear your point of view on. I think both films have a film noir feeling. Terminator is considerably more blatant about it, as far as the seedy hotels and the Venetian blinds everywhere.
Right.
Club that Sarah hangs out at is called Tech Noir.
Right.
And it's in big blinking bold letters above the dance floor during the famous shootout scene. In Sith, it carries on over the light and shadow Venetian blind motif in Yoda's quarters when Anakin and Yoda are talking about these visions that were just talked about with Padme dying.
Right.
But I think with that, it's more of a carryover from the noir feeling from episode 2, which was certainly a mystery and detective work and whatnot. So it was like a little carryover, but I thought it was interesting that both films shared that. Do you get that, based on with your knowledge of cinematography, how to approach lighting and shooting something like that?
Right.
That have that shared feeling?
Yeah, I think that, Sith had to have that visual style. just based on the story it was telling.
Another point I thought was interesting between the two is both films have what I called a disturbing slaughter of innocents. In Terminator, it's the poor women who happen to have the name Sarah Connor that get terminated by Arnold's character. He's going door to door, and that's what tips off our Sarah Connor as to, oh, something's going on here, something pretty serious. And I know there's also a few non-combatants that unfortunately get offed in the club, in the club scene. And in Sith, it's certainly more obvious with Anakin's just ruthless murder of the younglings. It's pretty harsh, but it's handled tactfully off screen. You know, it's insinuated, and you see the aftermath. It's certainly different than the cold-blooded killings of the Terminator in the Terminator movie. In both cases, the killers believe they're preserving a better future by killing these innocents. And I don't want to get all heavy on you here, but it brought to mind the philosophy of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, which was the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think it's more of an Anakin thing than the Terminator thing. But what do you see the similarities there, or is that just a stretch too?
I can see it, but I think it comes down to sort of that. I guess the thing that you would take from Star Wars is like that whole point of view thing. Because it's kind of the Terminator's point of view that, you know, I mean, even though it's a computer directive that he's got to kill these people to secure his future or the machine's future.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's not necessarily the point of view of like what we would want our hero to have, but so, you know, it's like both their point of views, they're thinking they're doing the right thing.
Right.
You know, so I can see that. Oh, this is completely out of left, well, not out of left field, but I had thought of this before when you were talking about Grievous.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not enough of a Star Wars geek to know the answer, but
we'll forgive you.
Blasphemy. In his chest, is that human?
Yeah, well, he's a cyborg too. He has a heart and lungs, and beneath his mask is humanoid eyes, and
right.
And he was once a great warrior. I know a lot of Star Wars geeks would be rolling their eyes right now with me struggling with this. I think it's the planet Ulee, Ulee, and his backstory is that he was a great tall warrior, and he was in a shuttle crash, and there wasn't much left, and Palpatine Darth Sidious, I should say, was involved in rescuing him and creating the Grievous that we see in Episode 3. And knowing that backstory to really geek out is cool, because he basically is a prototype for Vader.
Right.
If you think about it, he's just awkward. You know, I mean, I think it's funny because I know a fellow sci-fi geek who didn't care for Grievous's character was like, well, why would a robot be coughing? You know, why would a robot be coughing around and wheezing? I'm like, can you hear what you're asking? When people first saw Vader in Star Wars,
right,
there was huge debates whether he was a robot or a man, even though he was breathing.
Right.
You know, and I think that's interesting that they played on that. And of course, in the one animated Clone Wars series, they explained why Grievous does cough. You know, Mace Windu in a battle used a force to crush part of his lung, part of his suit, and which causes the coughing immediately in Episode 3. But I think, you know, I think there's something there, and I think, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's parallels there when you just look at his character. When you're talking about it before, and you were talking about the way Reese described the Terminator, it just made me think of that when you brought up Grievous. I mean, he is even more sort of a form of a Terminator for the Emperor than Anakin was.
Yeah.
So
No, absolutely. No. Yeah, there's a lot going on. It's funny because there's a lot of, I think it's almost at the essence of what Star Wars is, man versus machine.
right.
So, I mean, right back to A New Hope when Luke turns off his targeting computer and trusts in the Force to blow up the Death Star.
Right.
I mean, there's so many levels going on there, which is great. The last point I found between the two films, and again, this was after watching Sith this morning. I was like, why didn't I see this? Was that both films have a pregnant woman, a lead character, a lead female character, who was, of course, impregnated by the leading male character. And those women are carrying children who will be the ultimate warrior / saviors. Obviously, in Terminator, the baby is the payoff. John Connor is the payoff for the whole time continuing essence of the story.
Right.
And then in Sith, when we see the birth of Luke and Leia, it ties the prequels to the originals. And of course, Luke and Leia are involved in bringing Darth Vader, the Emperor, and basically the Empire down on its knees.
That's funny. That's like duh.
Yeah, and
I see that. I didn't see that either at all.
I mean, it's funny because it's the whole ending of Terminator, like her sitting there in the Jeep, rubbing her belly and talking in the tape recorder, and
right.
But it wasn't until I saw Padme, and it was like, wow, that's really wild because again, there's these future visions, and with the time travel thing, it's really about generations. What one generation does, reflecting upon another generation.
Right.
And usually you think it's the older generation that wishes to impose and change the newer generation. And in the case of Terminator, it's the reverse, which is interesting. It's the children that want to change the past. But I just thought it was interesting that I never drew that line between the two. I was so focused on the machinery. I was so focused on the killing machines that I didn't even think about the female characters, and that may be stereotypical or whatnot. Like, oh, the woman's going to be the nurturing character,
right?
But it's biologically necessary, and I think it's interesting that both films played on that.
Right. It is interesting.
Well, that's the list of things I found between the two films. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
I don't know. I think we went through it pretty good.
Is that code for?
There's a lot to think about there. I'd be curious. I think Cameron would not be happy with us though.
No, well, you know what? Tough. No, I think what's funny too, and I didn't even go there. I toyed with writing about it or researching it. I think it's interesting too that everything that we just talked about, all those bullet points, whatever, we're dealing with the films and dealing with the story, and we didn't even scratch upon the surface the fact that Lucas and Cameron, what they did for movie making from a technical point of view,
right.
And not only what they did for movie making from a technical point of view, but how they are shaping how films are enjoyed, released, etc. Lucas really pioneered the home theater system.
Right.
And some would argue the demise of going to the movies. and then in recent, I think it was a few weeks ago, there was a whole DirecTV thing with Cameron and fellow directors really upset that they were getting the rights to release movies on DirecTV so close to the theatrical release date.
Right.
Which of course that's certainly debatable, as these directors are most likely getting a cut of any profit that would come from such a transaction. But I thought, as we're going through this, like, wow, like just between Cameron and Lucas alone, there's a lot of parallels.
Yes.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for being part of our final episode this first season. I hope you had fun.
I did. Thanks for having me. It was an honor being on the last episode of the season. It was a good time. Thanks.
Cool. I'd say I saved the best for last, but then I piss off everybody else that's spent hours with me in an audiobook. But it was a lot of fun to get to this episode, and something that I sat alongside you in film class when we read essays about, when we read essays about the Terminator together. So this was a lot of fun.
Right.
So I really appreciate your time.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
For those of you who are interested in learning more about Dave's cinematography and storyboard work, please visit his website at www.lastofseven.com. That's www.lastof7.com. And I'd like to thank all the people that helped out this first season. It's been a lot of fun. And finally, thanks to all those who listen in, post comments on the blog, send emails of encouragement, and most importantly, watch and rewatch all the movies we're chatting about, because that's what this is all about. I'm thrilled that you're part of this little project and hope you join us when we kick off season 2. So until then, may the old school force be with you. Thank you. Thanks again, Dave.
No problem.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Digging Star Wars is produced by Mitch Media and has no connection to Lucasfilm Limited whatsoever. Copyrights for films, trademark characters, and related materials discussed in Digging Star Wars remain with their respective owners. For a list of references or source material, please send an email to diggingstarwars@gmail.com.
I don't know if it was the first Sarah Connor he goes to. He walks up to the house and he rings the doorbell first.
Yeah.
And it was just like, really? He rings the doorbell first? So now he's a polite Terminator? Like,